Welcome my friends, welcome back to Project TAS. If you're new to my channel, thank you for stopping by. If you've watched any of my previous videos, thank you for returning to my channel. Today we're doing another Blake 7 episode review from Season 1. As always, I will point out that this review will inevitably touch upon certain plot elements of this episode, and may even reveal developments for the series of Blake 7 as a whole. So if you haven't seen this episode or anything else in terms of Blake 7, a huge spoiler alert is in order in case you wish to do a bit of Blake 7 catch up prior to watching this review. You have been warned. Right, let's get to it, shall we? And right after Project Avalon, one of the episodes of Season 1 for me, we then get this. I said that Project Avalon was followed by 3 episodes of combined stories, and this is the first, and for me, the weakest. Breakdown. Gan's episode. Finally, can we have a proper look at a character that has been very much a bouncer on the Liberator? Not that there's anything wrong with bouncers, it's just that the bouncers I've met tend to have a personality. Gan unfortunately hasn't had much of a personality in the series so far. I've moaned about this before, about poor old Gan and his lack of development, so I won't repeat myself. Suffice it to say, as soon as it became clear that this was a Gan-centered story, I found myself quickly invested in it before it even started. Anything that can increase the character development of Gan would be welcome in my book. Regrettably, what we get is about a third of an episode of Gan throwing stuff about the place, and throwing people about the place, and smashing up various props. The remaining 2/3 of the episode he spends asleep. Or tranquilized. Or comatose. Perhaps David Jackson fell asleep after he read the script. Actually, that's a little bit of a disservice. There are certain segments or aspects of this episode that are deserving of praise. It's just that given the focus of the episode is supposed to be on the biggest man in the Blake 7 universe, we actually find ourselves learning a lot more about Avon. We get a braver, more proactive Villa, although we get a stupider, more gullible Callie. More on that in a bit. But suffice it to say, given this is supposed to be a Gan episode, it's unusual that it's the other characters that benefit from it. If anything, it's the proof in the Blake 7 pudding that Mr. Nation didn't have much else for Gan to do. He defended himself against the swine who killed his woman and got himself a brain limiter for his troubles, and he can beat lots of people up and rip things to pieces with his bare hands when required to do so. Nothing more to Olag Gan, I'm afraid to say, but that isn't why this episode is so poor. Since I mentioned the fact that this episode comprises of 2 stories, but not elaborated on this point as of yet, allow me to do so now. Gan is manning the flight deck when he suddenly starts experiencing pain in his head, forcing him to contort his face into a series of Quasimodo-type gurns. Jenna quickly pilots the ship out of an asteroid field that tried to take advantage of the situation, and by way of saying thank you, Gan knocks her unconscious. Blake stumbles across the scene and is himself also punished by Gan when he tries to be smiley and charming. Luckily, the others come to the rescue and hold Gan down long enough for Callie to not only get the tranquilizer pads, but also ask Jenna a really redundant question at a really stupid time about if she's okay, which really could have waited until after Gan was under control. I have mentioned that this episode isn't Callie's finest hour, and unfortunately it does get worse. Anyway, after a bit of brain scanning, the characters confirm what they already suspect, that a fault in Gan's limiter is causing him to go bananas. They put him under bed restraint and locate several possible places that could render medical aid. As it turns out, the closest possibility is Space Station XK-72, a research station that specialises in weaponry and space medicine, somewhere Avon had identified as a bolt hole, a possible retreat should things get too dicey on the Liberator, or if Blake becomes too insufferable. This of course is a later plot point in the episode, but suffice it to say for now that this is the ideal venue for Gan to get better. So that's the good news, the fact they just happened to be in the neighbourhood of Avon's holiday home. The bad news is that they were on the wrong side of a prohibited zone to the station when this emergency came up, and in order to get to the station they have to fly through a red spatial spiral without getting destroyed. Zen is particularly unimpressed with the idea of flying through this region of space, so he decides he won't help and switches himself off. A similar plot point to what was used in the episode Time Squad, although, as I previously mentioned in that review, it seems to have been thought through a little bit more here. But that's what the first part of this episode is about, their actual journey to the station. It's almost a separate story in itself. If this first part of the episode had something more to do with Gan, maybe catch up with him when he's a bit more with it, lying on his bed, talking about life, his background, learning more about him, I'd be totally fine with this. I'd be very appreciative of this. But, in true Michael Bay form, we get this whole thing about piloting the Liberator without computer backup, and then flying through this swirly-whirly thing. It's not mentioned again for the rest of the episode, which is Understandable, I guess. They've got through it, they now need to focus on Gan. It's such a grandiose plot line. It seems crazy to have such a humongous, life-threatening space phenomena to overcome before we get to the more BBC drama of the surgery. There's padding an episode out, adding a little bit of fat to get it up to the 50-minute mark, but this is something else. Entertaining? Yes, if we didn't keep having to watch Gan going all crazy and violent and see as our former warrior Callie becomes a nursemaid and decide to release the crazy violent patient from his restraint simply because he said please. I mean, come on. Yes, full marks to her for admitting this faux pas to Blake as soon as she's regained consciousness, but I'm sure Blake would have massively admonished her for being a total cretin if he hadn't had to rush off to sort out the mess she's created. Essentially, it's just another reason to see Gan causing mayhem for another couple of minutes, and this is really starting to wear thin by this point, especially all this grunting and congested breathing. Anyway, once the Liberator is through the swirly thing without so much as a dent, okay, maybe a couple of dents, we then start looking at Avon's bolt hole and speak to one of the three characters we all get to know from this neutral station. The station administrator, Farron, a rather slimy individual, starts getting all red tapey when Blake wants to get on with the whole wishy-washy life-saving thing, which Professor Kane, the station's surgeon extraordinaire, is more than happy to get on with, much to Farron's irritation. While Kane initially seems to be someone we'd want on our side when things need to get done, it unfortunately turns out that this neutral neurosurgeon is extremely pro-Federation, to the point where not only will he not perform the surgery on Gan unless he's having a gun pointed at him by Villa, but he'll even covertly call on a trio of Federation pursuit ships to come and destroy the Liberator. Hardly the qualities one would expect to find with a genius neurosurgeon whose reputation precedes him, but there you go. Kane is evidently more slimy than Farron. Kane's assistant Reno might be slimier than even that, as he flirts with Jenna and Callie with all the subtlety of Swiss Tony trying it on in a nunnery. However, he at least understands the medical oath he took, remonstrates with Kane as to his refusal to operate on Gan, and even prepares to attempt the operation himself. From charmless creep to principled hero, Reno, incredibly, is the best that XK-72 can offer.
How soon can you complete?
35 minutes?
Do it in 20.
Or you'll kill me.
No. In 25 minutes, I'm returning you to your station if you haven't completed your work.
Your threats don't bother me in the least, you know.
I shall destroy your hands. 20 minutes.
An awesome threat by Blake, touching upon the very things Kane needs to save lives, finally convinces a furious Kane to save Gan's life, after which he and Reno are teleported back to the station. While all this has been happening, Avon has been testing the water with Farron as to whether or not they would be prepared to let him remain with them. He dangles the secret of teleportation in front of the administrator's nose, and that's all the persuasion Farron needs. His compassion for Avon's crew is quite clear, the casual way he says that when the pursuit ships arrive, the Liberator will probably be destroyed. Like, whatever. Perhaps this is what convinces Avon to put off his timeshares purchase of the station for another time, and perhaps this is the proof you need, to know that Avon isn't as cold and self-serving as we might think. There are and will be further examples to the contrary, but for now we know that Avon doesn't feel as outcast on the Liberator as he might make out. The ending, however, leaves a lot to be desired. Farron and Kane have a huge argument, which is understandable given that Kane completely undermined their neutrality by calling Federation ships to blow up the Liberator, but for Kane to start trying to give orders to the weaponry department and then, even more bizarrely, start to strangle and then beat Farron to death. I really couldn't believe what I was watching. It is quite possibly the worst ending, or even worst scene in Blake 7. Okay, no, it's not the worst scene, there are others, but having just watched this scene again, I'm struggling to think of another. Comment below anything that comes to mind. Thankfully, Kane doesn't escape justice for long. The pursuit ship's grand attack on the Liberator involves firing 2 plasma bolts. One hits their target, the other misses, and takes out the station by mistake. I mean, it's presented a little better than the way I've described, but this is what it boils down to. It all feels a bit on the messy side. The actual final scene involves everyone gathering around Gan, who's back to normal for the first time since the opening 10 seconds before he started painfully gurning, and having a jolly good talk and even jollier laugh with him, just so we know everything is okay at the end. Like I say, there are good aspects of this episode. The question of Avon's loyalty to the crew and his willingness to remain with Blake is tested here. It's very good to address this. These people aren't soldiers or contracted to remain with Blake. They do so out of choice, or out of desperation, and it's been brought up in conversations before. But here the question of staying is brought into focus, and Avon was always going to be the only one who would seriously consider leaving. He stays on the Liberator, presumably because he learns that Kane has informed the Federation, and finds himself warning the crew he's thinking of abandoning. This is, in a way, an answer to the question of whether he wants to leave or stay, but it might have been nice to get the reasoning voiced a little more. It isn't completely answered, but at least we're happy that he's in the right place at the end of the episode. He may not realise it, but he is as well. The three characters we meet are well acted and are fairly interesting, or rather unpleasant in their own respective ways. One of the many faces of neutrality, a concept introduced to the episode that I quite liked and found interesting. The whole working out whether they can get Gan help is done well, and the camaraderie between the crew in a crisis is as engrossing as ever. It's not the worst episode of Series 1, but for me it's still down there with Time Squad and The Web. You may disagree, and that's absolutely cool. But if you were thinking that this episode is a little bit of a hodgepodge, as I've suggested, I personally think you'd be right. The swirly thing in space is an interesting obstruction to overcome, although as larger than life as it comes across, it doesn't actually serve any other purpose other than get through between a quarter and a third of the episode. Gan, the supposed focus of the story, spends his waking time gurning, grunting and breaking things. None of those three things holds much interest for long, and the ending of the episode is so stupid. And given this stupid ending is the last we see of what is already a pretty limp episode, it's difficult to try and give it any stars. Actually, it's impossible. That concludes my review on Breakdown. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like this video, please share this video, please subscribe to my channel, and please feel free to watch my other Blake 7 episode reviews. And I will be studying Dr. Reno's incredible chat-up lines, which he has recently had published. Cheerio!